Good evening. Welcome to the special broadcast of the virtual G20 summit that the Prime Minister's just made the opening remarks there. Prime Minister Narendra Modi inviting all the member countries of G20, also extending invite to the African Union and also other 11 international organizations, along with 9 countries that were invited to the G20 summit that India hosted in the month of September. And the Prime Minister talking about the achievements or the Delhi Declaration, taking it forward, especially in the changing world order, the steps that have been taken, especially in taking things forward from the Delhi Declaration that took place during that summit in September this year. Let's quickly take a look at the two important takeaways that the Prime Minister mentioned about. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi chaired that virtual summit of G20 leaders today evening to discuss the implementation of the Delhi Declaration adopted in September and several new challenges that have emerged since then. On release of 50 hostages held in Gaza, Prime Minister Modi during the G20 virtual summit welcomed the news of the release of hostages and hoped that all the hostages will be released soon.
आतंकवाद हम सभी को अस्वीकार्य है। सिविलियंस की मौत कहीं भी हो निंदनीय है। आज हुए हॉस्टेजेस के रिलीज के समाचार का हम स्वागत करते हैं। उम्मीद करते हैं कि सभी हॉस्टेजेस जल्दी रिहा हो जाएंगे। मानवीय सहायता का समय से और निरंतर पहुंचना आवश्यक है। यह सुनिश्चित करना भी जरूरी है कि इजरायल और हमास की लड़ाई किसी तरह का क्षेत्रीय रूप धारण न कर ले।
Well, while addressing the summit, Prime Minister Modi spoke about India's commitment to work for the welfare of all.
आज संकटों के जो बादल हम देख रहे हैं, वन फैमिली में वह ताकत है कि हम शांति के लिए काम कर सकते हैं। मानवीय कल्याण के दृष्टिकोण से हम आतंक और हिंसा के विरुद्ध और मानवता के प्रति अपनी आवाज बुलंद कर सकते हैं। आज विश्व की मानवता की इस अपेक्षा की पूर्ति के लिए भारत कदम से कदम मिलाकर चलने के लिए तत्पर है।
Well, to get a perspective on this particular opening remarks there by the Prime Minister on the summit, we are joined by our correspondent Akshay Dongre, joining us also Ambassador J.S. Mukul there with us, and Professor Swan Singh also taking the deliberations forward. Let me come first to you, Akshay. Looking at this particular virtual summit that takes place, some of the important takeaways that one should look forward to.
Well, one of the most important topic that many people have been talking about ahead of the G20 virtual summit was that whether the leaders will be talking in depth about the Israel-Hamas conflict. That in fact, there were signs that the conflict can in fact spread to a wider region. There can be a spillover. There have been talks of spillover, not just by just Israel, but the neighboring countries as well, by the United Nations as well, and that is the reason why Prime Minister Narendra Modi, while he's chairing this all-important G20 follow-up of the Leaders Summit, he has also said that the focus of all the world economies, world countries, should be on the fact that there is no spillover of this conflict because it has wider ramifications, not just for that particular region, but for the global economy as well. G20 being a premier forum for the world economics, economics will be a priority as far as these nations when their discussions are concerned. But any kind of spillover in the region, that is one of the most important regions as far as oil exporting countries are concerned, any kind of spillover can disrupt the global market, not just the economy, but also it can in fact lead to food insecurity in several regions that already have been suffering from the crisis that has been, or rather the ripple effects that have been there after the Ukraine war, especially in the African region. So that is why Prime Minister has focused on that. He has hoped for a solution of the ongoing ongoing conflict between these two parties, and said that he hopes that there is a peace in the region, and the countries should talk about the resolutions of the conflict. Besides that, he has talked about women development by giving example that Indian Parliament has enacted law where in not just Parliament but also in state assemblies there will be 33% seats for women reserved. He has talked about sustainable development goals. He has talked about how India itself is a country that is heading towards green energy transition and has asked for more countries to join. He has talked about DPIs and how repositories have been made and leading by example. Talked about $25 million commitment by just India as far as the digital infrastructure is concerned. Across the world, these kind of repositories can become extremely crucial as far as the digital revolutions are there. He has talked about not just here in this particular virtual summit, he has talked about artificial intelligence, its uses and its dangers earlier as well, and now today he highlighted them again.
Okay, Ambassador G.S. Mukul, terrorism is unacceptable. That's what the Prime Minister said. Is it a strong stance, especially considering the Israel-Hamas armed conflict, that this Prime Minister spoke about, especially at the G20 virtual summit?
It has been a consistent Indian policy earlier with regard to terrorism and also with regard to the recent conflict in West Asia.
Okay.
Now, what the Honorable Prime Minister said, let's look at it in two aspects. First is, of course, from the what your correspondent was also mentioning, the economic impact, because G20 being a premier forum for international economic cooperation, there is the food security dimension, there is the energy security dimension, there is the inflation issue, and it impacts the whole world, particularly the global south. So that is obviously of great concern to the whole world, including India and obviously the G20. The second aspect is what he specifically mentioned. Now, we should understand that the Prime Minister mentioned the principles. That was the condemnation of terrorism. He also said civilian deaths are deplorable wherever they happen. So that, I think, is a balanced statement in that sense, a well-calibrated and calculated statement. Then at the same time, he spoke of the need for humanitarian assistance being both adequate and timely. And there that India has already sent, I think, I was reading in the reports, about 70 tons of humanitarian assistance to Egypt, including a lot of medicines, etc. Then the Prime Minister voiced concern that this conflict should not spread further. It should not become a regional conflict. And that, I think, is obviously something of interest to the G20 at large, but to the whole world. And then in that sense, he concluded by saying that it is for everybody to work together as one family against the violence and terrorism on one side, but for humanitarianism on the other side. And in that, India stands ready to work with everyone. So I think a well-calculated summary of what we have been saying at different times, but putting it all together. And I think it is good that he mentioned in his inaugural speech, because this is a subject which we all expect to be flagged quite extensively during the summit, the ongoing summit. And there, I think the Prime Minister sort of set the ball rolling by spelling out India's position very clearly.
Professor Swan Singh, looking at the Prime Minister insisting to the international community at large, talking about the Israel-Hamas armed conflict not turning into a regional conflict, is that a bigger issue, or the motto that we believed in, especially on Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world is one family, taking that thought forward, in the new challenges that have emerged post the G20 summit that India hosted?
Anil, India today is, seen as a rising power, and world has both expectations from India, and India also have responsibilities in terms of engaging with what is happening in Middle East for various reasons. First of all, it's very unusual. For the first time, India is friendly to all the West Asian countries, from Egypt to Iran to UAE to Israel to Saudi Arabia, countries that sometimes don't talk to each other are all talking to India. Therefore, in September of 2021, when President Joe Biden wanted to start a second Quad for West Asia, he brought in UAE, Israel, US, and India. So world has expectations as to what is India thinking on what is happening in the region right now. Second, as I just mentioned before you came in, 9 million Indians live in that region. So India would not like to see this conflict expanding into a regional crisis. Already world is talking about how this Hamas-Israel war has derailed a process of rapprochement started by Abraham Accords between Israel, Bahrain and UAE. Now Saudi Arabia was joining it. It's derailed clearly. But equally derailed is a very important initiative that G20 saw in September. India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. So India has both responsibilities and stakes in ensuring that this conflict doesn't prolong, doesn't expand. But let me say, India's approach to the conflicts like this, you remember the Ukraine crisis as well, has been one of proactive neutrality, not to take any sides. So just as you saw Prime Minister mentioned, we condemn any act of terrorism of any kind. He also said we must oppose terrorism and violence. And any death of innocent people is unacceptable to India. So it's a very calculated, balanced, objective statement that we are seeing Indian Prime Minister making. We are also aware that India has already sent 2 consignments of humanitarian assistance to Gaza, along with talking to President Abbas at the same time, of course, talking to Prime Minister Netanyahu, because Netanyahu is a very close friend of Indian Prime Minister, so they have very good understanding with each other. So very, very nuanced approach of ensuring balance in how India wants to look at the conflict, how India wants to see that. But I understand, as Ambassador said, it's an economic forum. But when world leaders meet, they discuss such issues all the time. Already 5 national leaders of the G20, Italy, Germany, France, UK, and of course President Joe Biden of United States, have already physically visited Tel Aviv. You know, Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State of United States, have gone there 4 times in 4 weeks. So global leaders are very seriously engaged. That this is an issue up on their mind as a very significant issue, and I'm sure this issue will be discussed very clearly in the G20 summit meeting. And therefore, I saw Indian Prime Minister spending fair amount of time in outlining how is India looking at that issue and how India wants to see that resolved. You know, and we are of course starting with a very positive note. Just few hours before, Israel has already agreed for a ceasefire for 4 days with Hamas. For a long time, nobody was believing Israel will have any negotiations with Hamas because they were saying we want to eliminate Hamas. But now today we see that finally 4 days of ceasefire has been agreed, which means humanitarian assistance will be now moving into Gaza. We will see release of at least the first 50 hostages to be released. And Indian Prime Minister said we look forward to more being released likewise. So at least there is a pause button being pressed at that, you know, constantly destructive conflict. You know, everybody was fearing it could expand to other regions as well. But luckily, pause should help both sides to rethink and global leaders to get really active in intervening, influencing and engaging those actors on the ground to make sure violence is mitigated or at least stopped, you know, as much as possible. And some kind of, you know, stability, if not solution, is found as soon as possible.
You know, many things that the Prime Minister did highlight. Quickly, let's take a look at one more important issue that the Prime Minister highlighted there, especially when it comes to the concerns of the Global South. The Prime Minister highlighted that the concerns of the Global South countries need to be prioritized.
21वीं सदी के विश्व को आगे बढ़ते हुए ग्लोबल साउथ की चिंताओं को सर्वोच्च प्राथमिकता देनी होगी। ग्लोबल साउथ के देश ऐसी अनेक कठिनाइयों से गुजर रहे हैं जिनके लिए वे जिम्मेदार नहीं है। इस संदर्भ में समय की मांग है कि हम डेवलपमेंट एजेंडा को अपना पूर्ण समर्थन दें।
Okay, Ambassador J.S. Bokul, you know, Prime Minister talking about a global trust deficit, you know, turning into a relationship of trust. And especially with regards to the voice of the Global South, the pitch that India made, India has fulfilled. How do you see those two together, especially, you know, India emerging as a strong voice, especially for the Global South?
No, I think it was very clear when the Prime Minister mentioned that development agenda should be the main priority, and he clearly outlined that the global South countries, which have been suffering the most, and we know that they have been suffering because of the food crisis, the fertilizer crisis, the climate crisis, the energy crisis, the debt crisis. We know that, and it was that he was alluding to when he said that they are not responsible for many of these crises that they are suffering from, and then went on to say that development agenda should be prioritized, and the global economy and the global governance institutions should address these problems. He spoke of a bigger, better, more effective, and future-ready governance structure. And then, very interestingly, he linked it up with the G20 summit's action plan, because the SDGs, as you know, have been lagging behind their targets, and therefore the G20 summit in September had come out with a very detailed action plan for taking the SDGs or the development agenda forward. And in that context, he also referred to the Indian program of the aspirational district program, wherein he said that we have been able to raise 225 crore or 250 million people have been able to benefit from this, and extended an invitation to each member of the Global South to come and have a look and benefit from this.
Okay.
So I think in a very, very positive and a forward-looking message.
Okay, Professor Swan Singh, especially when it comes to the G20 consensus on tripling renewable energy capacity globally by 2030, as we dip into the COP28 summit that takes place in the Middle East, do you see, more and more countries ready to open their purse and help or contribute towards tackling this issue?
I really hope so, that India's presidency would contribute in building that consensus and political commitment of national leaders. That is where this second summit to stock take as to how have we moved forward or how should we move forward, because G20 is a grouping. The final declaration is not necessary to be implemented by everybody. They have to go home, do national level efforts, whether in regional forums or at the national legislatures, to implement that consensus that has been built here, including consensus on transition, energy transition that you mentioned. Of course, the fact that India's initial initiative of International Solar Alliance has received such global endorsement, 100+ countries are now in that alliance, and now the second global biofuels coalition being launched here, are initiatives that India is taking by ensuring that wherever India can contribute in terms of transferring Indian technology to others, to make sure there is a complementarity in relationship. That kind of effort, I think, is what India can do. Whether the developed world is willing to now begin to transfer finance or technology and help the world in energy transition in that sense, we'll have to see that. But I think India is not leaving any stone unturned in that sense and pushing that agenda forward. I assume world is realizing, countries of the Middle East are realizing. You see the way they are drifting in terms of building new areas of investments for future growth for themselves. They are aware of the fact that gradually this energy transition is going to be the only choice world has. Already you see world scientists are no longer talking of bringing the global temperatures to 1.5. They are now talking of 2 degrees Celsius, which means a lot of climate crises are already irreversible in that sense. And that realization should push these leaders now to, come to taking initiatives. And the global finance, climate finance, which is an issue lingering for more than 15 years now, should be somehow move forward in that sense. Transfer of technology and finance should happen finally. India is showcasing by example is what I'm underlining.
Okay, one final word from both of you, but I'll ask you both of you to keep it short and sweet. Quickly coming to you, Ambassador J.S. Mukul, is there something else that India could have achieved during its G20 presidency or something more?
I think we have achieved a lot. The challenge is going forward and getting those implemented. That is the main challenge going forward, because as I said, these will be taken to the different fora. And I think we have done very well in terms of a very rich menu of achievements.
Okay. Professor Swan Singh, is India's presidency going to be a tough act to follow for Brazil?
I am not saying that, Anil. You heard President Lula when he accepted 16 September, he said that himself. It's going to be a difficult sort of model to follow, as Brazilian said himself. So it's clearly recognized that India has put an enormous effort, and of course there is always one can be very ambitious, as the Prime Minister had said in December of last year. But enormous transformation has already come about, and my hope is that that transition that India is making sustain itself, because coming two presidencies are with Brazil and South Africa, which to me is IBSA. India has worked with these two countries, and I think that Troika relationship will be able to carry forward the transitions and transformation that India has brought about in global decision making as far as G21 is concerned.
Okay, it's a fruitful discussion that we've had. Thank you all three gentlemen for taking time out, joining us on this special broadcast. Ambassador J.S. Mukul, Professor Swarn Singh, and Akshay Dongre there joining us from the news pit. Well, that's it in this special broadcast. We're going to continue bringing more updates on this G20 virtual summit. The closing remarks by the Prime Minister would also be coming very soon. We're going to get you all that update as it breaks here on DD India. That's it in this special broadcast. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye. Take care.